I read this week Kevin Durant. He's a basketball player. He's got this whole elaborate routine he does to prepare himself to play. I listened to another guy who was talking about trying to get to the gym before LeBron James on game day, and he just gave up. He couldn't do it. And that's basketball. That's like a game. And if you think about it, you prepare yourself to do most things that you think are important. And what's more important than worship? Why wouldn't we prepare ourselves for it? It seems kind of obvious, unless we're thinking of what happens here a little differently than Christians have historically. Because if you look back, this is something that Christians used to talk about a lot. So if you think I'm being a little weird today, this is something that Christians have talked about a lot, and pastors would talk with their churches about too. And I'm talking like all the way back to the 100s. For example, Ignatius, who was a disciple of the Apostle John, wrote, "Let every one of you keep the Sabbath," and he means Sunday, the Lord's Day, "after a spiritual manner, rejoicing in meditation on the law, admiring the workmanship of God." And then later he says, "Let every friend of Christ keep the Lord's Day as a festival, the resurrection day, the queen and chief days of all the week." And that's something the church emphasized for thousands of years. In fact, I found that Ignatius quote in Thomas Watson, who was writing in the 1600s. And he was talking about prioritizing Sunday, the whole day, from morning to evening. And so he was even saying a little more than I'm saying. But he was saying that because of the importance of corporate worship. We should look upon this day, listen, this is a quote, as the best day in the week. What the sun is among the planets, that the Lord's day is among other days. And why? It's because this is a day in which we converse in a special manner with God. And as a result, he says, it is the market day of the soul. And so you can imagine back in the olden days when they had a market day where everyone would go to get what they needed for the week, because that's what he says is supposed to be happening here. This is the soul's festival day. On this day, the graces act their part. The other days of the week are most employed about the earth, this day about heaven. Then you gather straw, now pearls. Now Christ takes the soul up into the mount and gives it transfiguring sights of glory. Now Christ leads his spouse into the wine cellar and displays the banner of his love. And then he talks next about how to benefit the most from this time we have together. And he gives real specific instructions, which is something Richard Baxter did as well. And if you know Richard Baxter, he was another super practical Puritan, and he wrote about corporate worship, and he said, "Understand how great a mercy it is that you have permission to wait upon God for the receiving and exercise of grace, and to cast off the distracting thoughts and businesses of the world. And what an opportunity is put into your hand to get more in one day than this world can afford you all your lives," which is just so awesome. This is like an opportunity being put in your hand to get more in one day than this world can afford you all your life. And therefore, he says, come with gladness as to the receiving of so great a mercy, and with desire after it, and not with unwillingness as to an unpleasant task, as sinful hearts that love not God or his grace or service, and are weary of all they do, and glad when it's done. And he gave, I don't know how many specific instructions how to do that, but a lot. George Swinnock wrote, and I'm reading through a chapter he wrote on this on that Puritan podcast I do if you want more, but he wrote, "This time of sacred duty is a Christian's market day," and so that same image again. But then he focuses on making sure as we come that we're ready to do the work so that we can benefit. And he gives a couple illustrations, and he's like, you know what, if you have a shop and you know that there's a day when a lot of customers are going to come in, and that's the time that you choose to be lazy, you probably shouldn't expect to have that shop for very long or make much money. Or if you're a farmer, he says, and you know there are only certain times of the year to plow and to sow in, and you don't, you should expect a really small harvest. And he says, in the same way, these hours of praying and reading and hearing are the saint's opportunities and seasons of grace. If he be not then careful and conscientious to plow up the fallow ground of his heart and to sow to the Spirit, his return will be very inconsiderable. He will reap but a thin crop. And so he's like, if you care about your soul, you need to prepare for corporate worship. And then he says, look, even if you don't care about your soul, God cares about his glory. And though he stooped to give thee permission to seek his face and hear his voice, yet he will not be slighted by thee. That should be a hint that I'm quoting all of these, but he is a glorious and jealous majesty, and he esteems it a disparagement to him for any to wait upon him without their best. Though Uzzah be dead, yet he speaks to thee to take heed how thou touchest the ark. And so he's talking about that story in the Old Testament there and saying, be careful how you approach all this matters. I think one of my favorite authors, Jeremiah Burroughs, said it maybe best. He says, the duties of God's worship are great duties. They are the greatest things that do concern us in this world, and it is a sign of a very fleshly heart to treat them as if they were something small. And so he says that, and it's convicting, because I know my own heart can be pretty worldly, fleshly. Because he says that one sign our hearts are worldly is when we find ourselves thinking that the things we have to do in our career, or the things that we have to do in our family, or the things we need to do for our comfort are the most important matters for us to pay attention to. And we know we're thinking like that when they take all this priority in our lives and we're like, I can't be late to work. I can't be late to work. I got to get up early. Or I have to do this school assignment because school is so important. I got to stay up late. Or I can't miss this opportunity. And so if there's something we need to learn for work, we put our best efforts into it. Or if there's something we need to do for our family, we really focus on it. But we don't always prepare for prayer or for learning God's word, because it can feel more optional, honestly. And sometimes we don't even really see the need to prepare. And why is that? Burroughs says it's because we don't think of those as great matters. And yet they are. So he says, my brethren, I beseech you, learn this lesson this morning, to account the duties of God's worship great matters. They are the greatest duties that do concern you here in this world, for they are the honor that you give the Most High God, and are the things in which God communicates himself and his choicest mercies. And being so important, there is reason we should prepare. Business of great importance, we make great preparations for. And if we look down at Hebrews 10 again, clearly corporate worship is business of great importance, because he's using this idea of the high priest entering into the holy place as a picture to help us understand what we're doing as we draw near.